Hey, I'm going to start talking about version control now. So, version control is a way of tracking your files and keeping sets of files and managing the changes between them. Um, this is an example of perhaps a way that version control is done or was done commonly, where you have a folder that has your project in it, and this in this case is Countdown. And so you'd have your folder and your project. You make changes to it, and you get to a point where it seems pretty good. So you'll make a copy of it and keep working. And then at some other point, you'll make a copy of your changes and you'll put that somewhere. And it ends up being a pretty big mess. Hard to keep track of what changes you made and which files changed and which versions were even good versions to maybe go back to. Um, so this doesn't work all that well. But what if we could track the changes to each individual file? Then we could do something like in this diagram where you have milk on a list and your list changes. There's revision 1 and maybe you add eggs to your list, and so revision 2 has the new list with milk and eggs, but you can still refer back to revision 1 and check the difference between those. And then maybe you add juice to the list and you've got milk, eggs, and juice in revision 3 of the list. And then you can make another change set that does both, takes away juice and adds soup to give you revision 4. So if we could do this, if we could track changes to these files, then we have an idea of what those files looked like at any point in our history. We can see what changes happened. We can make sure that we can go back to good versions of our files if something goes wrong. And there's a whole lot more you can do by tracking changes. So here's just an example of just a screenshot of a merge tool or a diff tool that lets you see the differences between files. There's many elegant ways to improve your workflow just with tracking changes. And also, with tracking changes, you can share them with other people. Other people could make changes, and you could use those changes to improve your project. So here are just a few options, communities, and places where you can store code. There's GitHub, Assembler is one that I use, GitLab is getting popular, Bitbucket, we use that in class, and Team Foundation server from Microsoft, and you could have your own server just sitting on a bookshelf somewhere, implementing a version control software. So what we really want version control to be able to do is to give us the ability to store changes in our project, share those changes, see the history and keep track of that, manage branches so that you can try things out, do some experiments, and merge them back in if you need to. And so when multiple people make multiple changes, you want to be able to merge those changes together. There are a bunch of different types of version control out there. A bunch of people have made different software to help you out. There's two main kinds, centralized and decentralized. Centralized tend to be older, but there are still some in common use. There's Subversion, which is declining in popularity, but it was a big one. Perforce is still used a lot in the game industry, though it annoys me greatly. CVS is a really old one before Subversion. It was one of the originals. And Team Foundation server, again from Microsoft. TFS is used a lot in Microsoft projects. Integrates well with Visual Studio. But Microsoft has also added Git support, so you can use that instead. And then decentralized. There's Mercurial, which is sometimes abbreviated as HG. There's Git, and then some others worth mentioning, but not worth getting into: Plastic, Fossil, and Bazaar. And if you've heard of them, that's great. And if you know the difference between centralized and decentralized version control systems, that's great too. And there is none that's really the best. They all have differences, and a lot of those differences are driven by their popularity. So, especially open source ones, if they're more popular, then they improve faster. So the two that are really popular lately are Git and Mercurial. It seems that Git is the most popular, but Mercurial and Git have very similar feature sets, so you can't really go wrong using either one. So Mercurial is what we'll be using. It's distributed version control system, and that means that there's no centralized repository where that is like the one true source code that everybody is working with. So in older centralized version control systems, there always had to be one central repository that everyone made changes to. But with a distributed system, everybody has their own repositories, and you share changes between each other. Ideally, in a lot of cases, it is easier to have one master repository. Mercurial and other new version control systems support very fast branching and merging, and very intelligent merging. So there's a lot of changes you can make to files that the software can merge together without you doing any work at all. Just tell it to do its thing and it'll do it right. And they're really good at processing large projects, dealing with large projects. So here are a couple of links of some software that you should check out, and hginit.com has some further introductory material about how to use HG Mercurial and how to understand what it's doing. So here are a few things that you should know, some terminology. A repository, so that's a storage location for your source code and other assets, everything, all your files. Cloning or checking out is getting a copy of your repository. Your working copy is what you have locally, and that's what you're messing with. That's where your changes go as you're working. Pulling is getting new changes from a remote repository. Pushing is sending your changes off. Diffing, or getting a diff, is the differences between files or sets of files like folders. And then merging is combining different versions into one copy. So as I said, Mercurial is distributed, DVCS is distributed version control system. And so there might be one central repository that everybody communicates with in order to facilitate sharing all of their code. But each individual, in this case Joel, Rose, and Bob, they each have their own repository on their local machines. And so that's the repository that they're interacting with the most. They have their working directory where they make their changes, and everybody's working directory can be different. And they HG commit to make changes to their repository, and then HG update to get those changes into their working directory if their repository gets changed. And then from that repository, the local repository, they can push changes to share with everyone else. So here's some common tasks. I'm demonstrating here, just these pictures are from Tortoise HG, which may or may not be what you end up using. Depends on the interface. Some of it's a little messy. But here's cloning. So this is the hgclone command, and here's the dialog that comes up when you're cloning. And so again, that's getting a copy of a repository. Here's hg workbench and synchronize. These are things that are really only in Tortoise HG, but the idea is an easy place where you can update your code from changes that other people made, pull their changes, and push your changes. So you should pay attention to these icons that show up on these windows. There's a pull icon and a push icon, and then these, which are mostly for checking for changes. So hg pull is getting new change sets from the remote repository. In Mercurial, it doesn't update your working copy, so you have to do another command, hg update, afterward to make sure that you have updated code. And so when you do that, you'll get this dialog, and from there you'll merge those changes into your working copy. If you haven't made any new changes or anything that conflicts, it'll merge cleanly and right away. hg commit is how you make changes and store them in your local repository. It doesn't push them out to be shared, so you can build up a whole bunch of changes and then push them all at once to the remote repository. In this dialog, which I hate, but it's there, you check off the file changes that you're going to be sending or saving, and then you put in a message, which you have to do every time, and then you press commit. And it doesn't always give you like a success message that's very obvious, so as long as the commit works, it'll gray out. And then hg push is to send your changes, the ones that you've committed, to the remote repository. Alright, so again, that's how it works. That's what it looks like. Alright, so let me get back. Alright, so that's how version control works, and I hope you understand a little bit better. We're going to get into using version control so that you actually have some practice with it. See ya.